Imagine a world where your entire worth was tied to a wedding ring, a time when every breath you took, every step you made, was judged not by your actions, but by your marital status. What if your very existence without a husband was seen as a burden, a failure, a stain on your family's honor? Welcome to 1245. Number 10. The perceived failure to fulfill a woman's purpose. In the year of our Lord 1245, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and the unspoken expectations that governed every life. For women especially, these expectations were as rigid as the stone walls of a castle keep. Society, from the humblest peasant hut to the grandest royal court, held a fundamental belief. A woman's primary, indeed almost singular, purpose was to marry and bear children. To remain unmarried, to reach the age of maturity without a husband, was not merely an inconvenience. It was a profound societal and personal failure. It was as if you had been given a vital role in a grand play, but you simply stood still, watching the curtain fall without ever speaking your lines. This pervasive belief formed the bedrock of numerous struggles for unmarried women, casting a long, heavy shadow over their lives. Consider the prevailing worldview of the time. The Church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, taught that marriage was a holy sacrament, a divinely ordained union for procreation and companionship within strict Christian bounds. From birth, a girl was groomed for this destiny. Education, if she received any beyond household tasks, revolved around skills that would make her a suitable wife and manager of a home. Her dowry, meticulously gathered over years by her family, was not just a collection of goods. It was her ticket to a legitimate future, her social security. If a woman failed to secure a husband, it meant that this elaborate, lifelong preparation had been in vain. It implied a failure of her family to arrange a suitable match, a failure of her own perceived attractiveness or virtue, or perhaps even a failure of divine favor. This stigma of failing to fulfill a woman's purpose was deeply internalized and projected outwards. A young woman who remained unmarried past the usual age, typically in her late teens or early 20s, became a subject of whispered conversations. Neighbors would cluck their tongues, speculating about the reasons. Was she too plain? Was her dowry too small? Did she have some hidden flaw of character that scared away suitors? Chronicles from the era, such as those found in monastic libraries, sometimes refer to women who lacked a suitable match with an almost pitying tone, often followed by a description of their eventual quiet decline into obscurity or dependence. These narratives, while not explicit condemnations, subtly reinforced the idea that their unmarried state was a deviation from the natural order, a missed opportunity for a fulfilling life as defined by the community. The shame associated with this perceived failure extended beyond the individual woman to her family. For a family, particularly one seeking to improve its social standing or secure alliances, an unmarried daughter was a liability. She represented an unused asset, a potential marriage connection that had not been forged. Continued presence in the household, without contributing to its future through a marital alliance or the production of heirs, could be seen as an ongoing drain on resources, both economic and social. Father's honor could be questioned, his ability to manage his household and provide for his children deemed inadequate if he could not secure a proper match for his daughter. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid this outcome, often arranging marriages when girls were mere children, emphasizing the urgency and importance of fulfilling this societal expectation. Consider Elara, a woman in a small village in northern France, born in 1220. Her family were prosperous peasants, hoping to marry her to the son of a neighboring, slightly wealthier family to consolidate land. Prospective groom died in an accident, and Elara's family, having put all their hopes into that one match, struggled to find another. As Elara approached her mid-20s, a formidable age for an unmarried woman, she became the subject of quiet scrutiny. The village women, bustling with their children and chores, would eye her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They saw her as an anomaly, a woman who had somehow bypassed her essential destiny. In the communal washhouse, conversations would fall silent when she approached, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. Elara felt the weight of these unspoken judgments, a constant, low hum of disapproval that permeated her daily life. She was not overtly ostracized, but she was subtly marginalized, always on the periphery of the fertile, bustling core of married life that defined the village. Her inability to fulfill the expected role meant she was perpetually viewed as incomplete, a woman who had failed to achieve her fundamental purpose in the tapestry of medieval society. This perception of failure, often unspoken but deeply felt, was a heavy burden, shaping every interaction and limiting her sense of self-worth in a world that valued women primarily for their contributions to marriage and lineage. Number 9. Limited economic opportunities and financial insecurity. Life in 1245 was, by modern standards, a brutal struggle for survival, and for unmarried women, this struggle was compounded by severely limited economic opportunities and pervasive financial insecurity. In a world where one's livelihood was almost entirely dependent on physical labor, land ownership, or a skilled trade, women's access to these means was dramatically curtailed, and without a husband, their situation became precarious in the extreme. The lack of a male protector and provider meant an unmarried woman often stood on the very edge of destitution, always just a step away from genuine hardship. The economic structure of medieval society was inherently patriarchal. Land, the primary source of wealth and sustenance for the vast majority of the population, was typically held by men. While women might inherit land in certain circumstances, particularly if they were the sole heirs or hold dower rights to their deceased husband's property, direct ownership and control were largely male prerogatives. For an unmarried woman, inheriting land was rare and often conditional. If she had brothers, the land would pass to them. If she was the sole heir, the expectation was that she would quickly marry, and her husband would then assume control of the property. Thus, for most unmarried women, access to land was a pipe dream, leaving them without the fundamental resource for self-sufficiency. Beyond agriculture, urban centers offered some alternative forms of labor, but here too, unmarried women faced steep hurdles. Guilds, which controlled most skilled trades and crafts, were predominantly male institutions. While women might work alongside their fathers or husbands in family businesses, becoming a master craftswoman in her own right was exceptionally rare. Records from cities like London or Paris from the 13th century occasionally show women listed as operating small businesses, such as alewives, bakers, or chandlers, but these were typically widows who inherited a thriving business or women from wealthy merchant families who could afford to establish independent ventures. For the average unmarried woman, entering such trades independently was nearly impossible due to lack of capital, training, and acceptance within the male-dominated guild structures. Types of labor available to unmarried women were generally low-wage, physically demanding, and often transient. They might work as domestic servants in wealthier households, performing tasks like cleaning, cooking, and laundry for meager wages and board. Agricultural labor, such as harvesting crops, spinning wool, or tending livestock, was another option, but again, the pay was often insufficient to sustain a single individual, let alone allow for any accumulation of savings or property. A common phrase among scholars studying medieval economic life points to the reality that a woman, unless born into extreme wealth, usually needed a man's economic support to thrive, or often, simply to survive. An unmarried woman, therefore, lacked this crucial pillar of support. Consider the plight of Isolde, a young woman in a bustling market town in England. Parents, humble laborers, died within a year of each other, leaving Isolde, still in her late teens, with no dowry and no immediate family willing to take her in permanent. She sought work as a domestic servant, finding a position in the household of a merchant. Her days were long and arduous, starting before dawn and ending long after dusk. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and hauled water, all for a pittance and a place to sleep on the floor near the kitchen fire. She had no security. If she fell ill, she risked being dismissed without pay. If the merchant's family moved, she would be out of work. She yearned for a future where she did not live hand to mouth, but her options were starkly limited. She could continue as a servant, hoping for a kind employer and a steady wage, or she could try her hand at selling small goods in the market, a venture fraught with risk and requiring initial capital she did not possess. The path to economic independence seemed impossibly steep, paved with endless toil and shadowed by the constant threat of poverty. This perpetual financial precariousness was a suffocating reality for countless unmarried women, a silent, grinding anxiety that overshadowed every aspect of their lives and forced many into desperate situations simply to feed themselves. Number 8. Loss of social protection and increased vulnerability. In the rough and tumble world of 1245, social protection was not a given. It was something largely derived from one's connections, especially through male kin. For an unmarried woman, the absence of a husband, a father, or a strong male relative to act as her guardian and advocate left her alarmingly exposed and vulnerable in myriad ways. She was essentially a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of patriarchal norms and societal dangers, with little formal recourse for protection or justice when faced with exploitation or aggression. The concept of femme covert was central to the legal and social standing of married women. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed by that of her husband. While this meant a loss of independent legal rights, it also conferred a significant degree of protection. Her husband was legally responsible for her debts, her actions, and her safety. He represented her in legal disputes, acted on her behalf in property matters, and was expected to defend her honor and person. A married woman, therefore, had a direct, legal, and socially recognized protector. An unmarried woman, a femme soul, retained more legal independence on paper, but this often translated into a practical absence of protection. While she could technically own property, make contracts, or sue in court, these rights were often theoretical rather than practical, especially for women of ordinary means. Without a husband, a father, or a brother to speak for her, an unmarried woman was an easier target for various forms of exploitation. She might be defrauded in business dealings, with little power to seek redress. Her wages might be withheld, or she might be forced to accept unfair labor conditions, knowing that her complaints would likely go unheard. Accounts from legal documents of the period, such as court rolls and manorial records, occasionally detail cases where unmarried women were victims of petty theft or deception, and their pursuit of justice was often more arduous and less successful than that of a man or a woman with male representation. They simply lacked the social leverage to ensure their rights were respected. Beyond economic exploitation, unmarried women were also at greater risk of physical harm and sexual violence. The societal norms of the time offered little protection to women who were not under the direct guardianship of a man. If an unmarried woman was assaulted, her claims might be viewed with skepticism, or she might face accusations of having provoked the attack, especially if she was perceived as living independently or without proper supervision. The concept of female honor was inextricably linked to chastity, and a woman who was not married and therefore not protected could be seen as morally suspect, making her a less credible victim in the eyes of the community and the law. This was not to say that married women were immune from violence, but the social and legal repercussions for harming them were often more severe because their husbands were expected to respond with force or legal action. Consider Avelina, a young woman from a small rural community in the French countryside. Her elderly father died, leaving her alone, as her brothers had moved away years ago. Avelina tried to manage their small plot of land, but without male help, it was a constant struggle. One day, a neighboring farmer, known for his aggressive nature, began to encroach on her land, moving boundary stones and allowing his cattle to graze on her meager crops. Avelina appealed to the village reeve, a local official, but her pleas were met with indifference. "You need a man to manage this land, Avelina," he grumbled. "This is not a woman's task." The farmer, emboldened by her lack of male backing, continued his incursions. Avelina knew that if she had a husband, he would confront the farmer directly, perhaps even resorting to a physical altercation if necessary, and the reeve would have been compelled to intervene more decisively. But alone, Avelina was powerless. Isolation left her vulnerable, her rights trampled upon, and her future on the land increasingly untenable. This profound lack of social protection, the absence of a male shield in a world that often valued might over right, forced many unmarried women into impossible situations, leaving them exposed to exploitation, injustice, and even physical danger without recourse. Number 7. Pressure to join a convent for those with means. While many unmarried women faced the grim specter of poverty and social marginalization, for a select group, primarily those from noble or wealthy merchant families, another path, seemingly more honorable, was often presented: the convent. Far from being a personal spiritual calling, for many women in 1245, joining a convent was less a choice and more a socially mandated alternative to marriage, especially when suitable husbands were scarce, or when families needed to dispose of superfluous daughters without diminishing their social standing. It represented a unique form of social control, offering a protected, though circumscribed, existence in exchange for a life of perpetual celibacy and spiritual devotion. Church, in its vast influence, provided one of the few legitimate spaces for women outside of marriage and motherhood. Convents offered education, a structured life, and a degree of intellectual and spiritual fulfillment that was inaccessible to most laywomen. Families securing a place for a daughter in a prestigious convent could maintain family honor and status, especially if she was considered too plain, too sickly, or simply unmarriageable due to a lack of dowry or suitable suitor. It was a convenient way to avoid the shame of an unmarried daughter lingering in the family home, a burden on resources, and a blot on their reputation. This arrangement was often more about familial politics and economic pragmatism than genuine religious vocation. However, entering a convent was not a simple matter of personal inclination. It required a significant financial contribution, often in the form of a dowry or portion paid to the convent, which could be substantial. This meant that only families with sufficient wealth could afford to send a daughter to a nunnery. For the poor, this option was entirely out of reach. Thus, the convent, while offering a semblance of refuge, was a luxury, a gilded cage for those who could afford it, and a non-existent option for the vast majority. The pressure on these women could be immense. Imagine Elara, the third daughter of a minor baron in England. Older sisters had been successfully married off, their unions strengthening family alliances and securing more land. Elara, however, was born with a noticeable limp, making her less desirable in the marriage market, where physical perfection was often prized. As she approached her late teens, her parents, increasingly anxious about her future, began to subtly steer her towards the local Benedictine convent. They spoke of the pious life, the sanctity of devotion, and the peace found within the cloister wall. They commissioned beautiful vestments for her, symbolizing her future commitment. While Elara held a quiet piety, her true desire was for a life in the secular world, perhaps managing a household. She understood the unspoken truth. Her parents needed to secure her future, and the convent was the most honorable solution available to them. To refuse would be to bring shame upon her family, to become a perpetual burden, and to undermine their careful social maneuvering. Once inside the convent, a nun's life was strictly regulated. While shielded from the harsh realities of the outside world, she was also separated from it entirely. She could not marry, could not have children, and her daily life was dictated by prayer, study, and manual labor within the confines of the monastic walls. She exchanged one form of constraint for another, trading the expected societal role of wife and mother for that of a bride of Christ, an equally predefined and unyielding role. Letters and chronicles from the period occasionally hint at the quiet despair of women who had been forced into this life, their personal aspirations subsumed by familial expectation and religious obligation. Convent, therefore, while a legitimate and often respected institution, frequently functioned as a societal pressure valve, absorbing those women deemed unsuitable for marriage and channeling their lives into a path that, while offering dignity, often came at the cost of personal agency and worldly choice. Number 6. Accusations of immorality or witchcraft. In the shadows of medieval society, where ignorance often mingled with fervent religious belief, unmarried women, especially those who lived independently or displayed unconventional behavior, faced a chilling and dangerous stigma, the accusation of immorality or, even more terrifyingly, witchcraft. This was not a minor social slight. It was a potentially life-threatening charge, born from a potent cocktail of misogyny, superstition, and a deeply ingrained suspicion of women who existed outside the traditional confines of male control. The concept of female morality in 1245 was intrinsically linked to marital status and virginity before marriage. Unmarried woman, particularly one who was no longer young, was often viewed with suspicion regarding her chastity. If she had no husband to vouch for her virtue and no father or brother to supervise her, the community might assume the worst. Rumors could spread like wildfire, whispering about illicit liaisons, hidden children, or even worse, about a woman who had given herself over to sin. Legal records from the era, though more common in later centuries, occasionally show examples of women being publicly shamed or even punished for perceived moral transgressions, often based on little more than gossip and their unmarried status. This stigma meant that an unmarried woman had to be scrupulously careful about her conduct, far more so than her married counterparts, lest she invite social condemnation and ruin her already precarious reputation. Even more terrifying was the potential accusation of witchcraft. While the full-blown witch hunts were centuries away, the seeds of suspicion against women, particularly those perceived as other or unnatural, were firmly planted in the 13th century. Unmarried woman, especially if she was elderly, lived alone, or possessed unusual knowledge of herbs and healing remedies, could easily become a target. Her independence, her lack of a male protector, and her deviation from the norm made her a convenient scapegoat for unexplained misfortunes in the community's sick livestock, failed harvests, or strange illnesses. Church doctrine, while still developing its full stance on witchcraft, certainly fueled the idea of demonic influence and the susceptibility of women to temptation. Local superstitions, passed down through generations, solidified the image of the solitary woman as a potential malefactor. Imagine Agnes, an elderly woman in a small German village. She had never married, having spent her youth caring for her ailing mother. After her mother's death, Agnes lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the village, supporting herself by tending a small garden and offering her knowledge of poultices and herbal teas to the sick. She was quiet and kept to herself, which only fueled suspicion among some of the villagers. When a series of inexplicable events occurred, a cow died of a strange ailment, a child fell ill with a fever that no conventional remedies could cure, and a sudden storm destroyed crops, whispered accusations began. Agnes, some muttered, she lives alone, she has no man to guide her, and she knows too much about strange herbs. Others pointed to her unblinking gaze and her tendency to appear unexpectedly as proof of her unholy dealings. Her independence, her self-sufficiency, and her knowledge, instead of being seen as strengths, were twisted into evidence of her dark nature. Though Agnes never faced a formal trial, the village turned against her. Children were warned away from her cottage, women averted their gaze, and the once friendly greetings turned to cold silence. She became an outcast, a pariah, living under the constant shadow of a terrible accusation, her very existence outside the bounds of marriage interpreted as a sign of sinister intent. This deep-seated fear and suspicion meant that the life of an unmarried woman, particularly an older one, could be fraught with danger, constantly at risk of being branded as immoral or, even worse, as a practitioner of dark arts. Number 5. Social exclusion and marginalization from community life. Life in 1245 was intensely communal. From the rhythms of the agricultural year to the celebrations of religious festivals and the daily hustle of market life, nearly every aspect of existence was interwoven with the fabric of the community. Yet for unmarried women, this communal spirit often came with a cruel caveat: subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, social exclusion and marginalization. Without the defined role of wife and mother, they often found themselves on the periphery, outsiders looking in on the vibrant, interconnected world of married couples and families. The very structure of medieval social life revolved around the family unit. Public gatherings, feasts, and even daily visits between neighbors often centered on discussions of children, marital affairs, and household management. Women's social networks were largely built around shared experiences of marriage, childbirth, and raising families. For an unmarried woman, particularly one who had never been married, participating in these conversations could feel awkward, or she might be implicitly excluded. She simply did not share the common ground that bonded the majority of women in her community. This wasn't always a deliberate act of cruelty, but rather a natural consequence of a society where marital status was the primary social identifier. Consider the role of married women in communal activities. They would gather to assist each other during childbirth, share child-rearing advice, participate in cooperative labor like spinning or weaving bees, and often form informal support networks. An unmarried woman might find herself on the fringes of these groups. She might be invited out of politeness, but her input on child rearing would be considered less valuable, her advice on household management less informed. She was a perpetual observer, rather than an active participant in the core activities that defined female communal life. Chronicles from the time, such as those detailing village life or the records of guilds, often refer to women in their roles as wives or mothers, seldom recognizing the independent unmarried woman as a significant social actor outside of specific, limited contexts like domestic service. Even in religious life, which was ostensibly open to all, an unmarried woman could feel marginalized. While she could attend church and participate in rituals, the emphasis on family and the sanctity of marriage, often preached from the pulpit, subtly reinforced her anomalous status. In some communities, unmarried women might be seated separately or treated with less deference during communal meals or celebrations. Their social standing, without a husband to elevate or define it, remained ambiguous and often lower than that of their married peers. Imagine Marjorie, a woman in her late 20s, living in a small farming village in northern England. Prospects for marriage had dwindled after a series of family misfortunes and a poor harvest that left her family with little dowry to offer. While she was a hard worker and contributed to her family's farm, her social life was severely limited. During the annual harvest feast, when the whole village gathered to celebrate the bounty of the land, Marjorie found herself sitting apart from the main groups. The married women gossiped and laughed, their arms linked as they shared food and stories of their children. Their husbands gathered nearby, discussing crops and local affairs. Marjorie would find herself at the edge of conversations, sometimes offered a polite but fleeting comment, then quickly forgotten as the general merriment continued. No one meant to exclude her, but she simply didn't fit into the established social pairings. When couples danced, she had no partner. When children were blessed, she had no lineage to present. She was physically present, yet socially absent, a silent observer in a world that moved in pairs and families. This constant, subtle marginalization, the feeling of being perpetually outside the main current of community life, could lead to profound loneliness and a deep sense of isolation for many unmarried women, no matter how physically integrated they might appear to be. Number 4, the burden of being a dependent or a ward. For many unmarried women in 1245, the absence of a husband did not necessarily mean independent living. More often, it meant a perpetual state of dependence, shifting from the guardianship of a father to that of a brother, an uncle, or even a distant relative. This was not merely a matter of financial support, but also a matter of social control. Unmarried woman was rarely seen as truly autonomous, but rather as someone who needed a male protector and supervisor, a ward of her family, regardless of her age. This status, while offering some protection, often came with a heavy psychological burden and a profound lack of personal agency. In medieval society, women were legally and socially considered to be under the authority of a male guardian for most of their lives. Daughter remained under the legal control of her father until marriage. Upon marriage, that control transferred to her husband. If a woman became a widow, she might regain some legal independence, but even then, a male relative might step in as a guardian, especially if there were children or property involved. Unmarried women who never entered matrimony remained in a perpetual state of legal and social minority, never fully transitioning to the status of an independent adult in the eyes of the law or the community. This meant that her decisions, even about her own life, were often subject to the approval of her male guardians. She could not easily enter into contracts, manage significant property, or make major life choices without their consent. Her labor, her movements, and her social interactions might be monitored and controlled. While some families might have been benevolent in their guardianship, others might have viewed an unmarried daughter or sister as a burden, someone to be managed rather than empowered. Records from manorial courts or family chronicles sometimes reveal instances where brothers or uncles made decisions regarding an unmarried woman's inheritance, living arrangements, or even her continued spinsterhood, often without her direct input, reflecting her status as a dependent. Imagine Isolde, a woman in her late 30s living in a prosperous merchant household in a bustling Flemish town. Her father had died years ago, and her older brother, a successful merchant, had taken over the family business and, by extension, Isolde's guardianship. Isolde was skilled with numbers and had a keen eye for business, often assisting her brother with the accounts. She yearned to open her own small shop, perhaps selling fine linens or spices. She had saved a small amount from her work and believed she could make a success of it. However, when she broached the subject with her brother, he dismissed the idea out of hand. A woman alone in business, unheard of, what would people say, and who would protect you from unscrupulous traders? No, sister, your place is here in my household, assisting me. He genuinely believed he was protecting her, but in doing so, he extinguished her aspirations. Isolde was entirely dependent on him for her board, her clothing, and her social standing. To defy him would mean risking destitution and social ostracism. She felt trapped, a perpetual child in her brother's house, her adult intellect and desires stifled by her dependent status. The psychological toll of this dependence could be profound. it stripped women of agency and self-determination. They might feel like perpetual guests in their own homes, or live with the constant anxiety of being a burden, particularly if their male relatives were less than charitable. This pervasive oversight and the implicit assumption that they could not manage their own lives created a stifling environment, limiting their opportunities for growth, self-expression, and genuine independence. The unmarried woman, regardless of her age or capabilities, was often seen and treated as a ward, perpetually beholden to the authority and decisions of the men who controlled her life. Number 3. Lack of inheritance and property rights for the female line. 1245, the intricate web of inheritance and property rights was a cornerstone of social order, wealth, and power. Unmarried women navigating this system was fraught with immense challenges, as prevailing customs and laws overwhelmingly favored the male line. The inability to inherit or control property independently, or to pass it on to one's own descendants, was a profound stigma, fundamentally undermining an unmarried woman's economic security and social standing, often condemning her to a life of perpetual dependence. The feudal system, which dominated much of Europe, was built upon the concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the entirety of the family's land and titles. Daughters, regardless of age, were largely excluded from this direct inheritance. While some regional variations and specific charters might allow for dower rights, a widow's right to a portion of her deceased husband's land for her lifetime, or rarely, for daughters to inherit in the complete absence of male heirs, these were exceptions to the rule. For an unmarried woman, without a husband to tie her to a family's land or a father with no sons, her prospects for inheriting substantial property were virtually non-existent. Even if a woman were to inherit property in rare circumstances, her ability to control it independently was often severely curtailed. If she was unmarried, her male guardians, her father, brother, or uncle, would typically manage the property on her behalf. Upon marriage, control would transfer entirely to her husband. This meant that the concept of an unmarried woman independently owning and managing significant land or wealth was almost an anomaly, reserved for extremely wealthy widows or women from powerful, land-rich families whose unique circumstances allowed them to defy the norm. For the vast majority, property was a male domain, and an unmarried woman was merely a transient caretaker, not a true proprietor. The societal implication of this was immense. Property meant power, security, and a future. Without it, an unmarried woman lacked the fundamental building blocks of self-sufficiency. She could not establish an independent household, support herself through rents or produce, or secure her old age. She was perpetually reliant on the charity or good graces of her male relatives, or forced into menial labor. This financial vulnerability was not merely a practical concern. It was a profound social stigma, marking her as someone without a firm place in the established order, a woman who could not contribute to the perpetuation or enhancement of a family line through the traditional means of land and wealth. Consider the case of Beatrix, a woman from a lesser noble family in Aquitaine. She was the youngest of 4 daughters, and her parents had successfully married off her older sisters to neighboring lords, solidifying alliances and expanding their influence. However, by the time Beatrix reached marriageable age, her family's fortunes had waned, and there were no suitable alliances left for her. 2 younger brothers, still boys, were the designated heirs to the family's modest estates. Beatrix knew that the land, the source of her family's income and status, would pass entirely to them. She had no claim, no portion that she could call her own, despite having lived and worked on the estate her entire life. Only hope for a secure future, outside of finding an extremely unlikely match, was to remain in her brother's household, a perpetual dependent. The emotional impact of this situation was devastating. Beatrix saw her brothers, still young and inexperienced, as the future of the family, while she, a capable and intelligent woman, was relegated to the sidelines. She understood that her inability to inherit meant she would always be a guest in her own ancestral home, relying on her brother's generosity. This lack of legal and economic standing often led to a profound sense of powerlessness and an internalized feeling of worthlessness. Without the tangible asset of land or property, an unmarried woman's social identity was diminished, and her prospects for a dignified, independent life in a world obsessed with lineage and possessions were severely curtailed, leaving her vulnerable and dependent in a society that offered few other legitimate paths to security. Number 2, social scrutiny and pressure to marry. Imagine living under a microscope, your every action, your very existence, perpetually scrutinized by your community, all because you hadn't done the one thing society expected of you: get married. In 1245, for an unmarried woman, the pressure to find a husband was not just a gentle suggestion. It was an unrelenting social force, a constant, pervasive weight that colored every interaction and shaped every aspect of her daily life. This intense scrutiny and the accompanying pressure were powerful stigmas, designed to enforce conformity and ensure that women fulfilled their prescribed societal role. From the moment a girl reached adolescence, typically around the age of 12 or 13, the subject of marriage became a dominant theme in her life and in the lives of her family. Her family, her neighbors, and even distant acquaintances would constantly inquire about her prospects. Has a match been found for young Name? She's blossoming. Surely a suitor will come knocking soon. These seemingly innocuous questions carried an underlying message. Your worth, your future, is defined by your ability to secure a husband. For an unmarried woman who had passed the customary age of marriage, which, by the mid-13th century, could range from the late teens to the early 20s, depending on social class and region, the scrutiny intensified. The social pressure manifested in numerous ways. Older women in the community, often well-meaning but deeply entrenched in societal norms, might offer unsolicited advice on how to attract a husband, from improving one's needlework to cultivating a more demure demeanor. Matchmakers, if present in the region, might approach families with desperate proposals, sometimes for less than ideal partners, simply to settle an unmarried daughter. The local gossip mill would churn, dissecting her appearance, her behavior, her family's dowry, and speculating on why she remained unwed. This constant public discussion of her personal life, often behind her back, chipped away at her self-esteem and made her feel like a public spectacle, a problem to be solved. The pressure wasn't just external, it was often internalized. An unmarried woman might feel a profound sense of shame and inadequacy, believing that her failure to marry was a personal failing. She might withdraw from social gatherings, avoid eye contact, and feel a constant sense of unease. The expectation was so deeply ingrained that to defy it, even passively, was to invite social opprobrium. The idea that a woman might choose not to marry was almost unthinkable for the vast majority of people. It was assumed that if she remained unwed, it was due to some inherent flaw or misfortune. Consider the predicament of Gisela, a miller's daughter in a busy town in Flanders. Gisela was intelligent and capable, helping her father manage the accounts and the bustling mill. However, by the age of 24, considered quite old for a first marriage, she had not found a suitable husband. Family, once proud of her capabilities, now looked at her with a mixture of concern and exasperation. During Sunday Mass, she felt the eyes of the other women on her, their whispers, "Still no husband for Gisela," followed by sighs of pity or thinly veiled judgment. When she went to the market, the local women would ask her mother, "Why is your Gisela still unmarried? Is there something wrong with her?" The pressure was relentless. Even her younger sister, still a teenager, was subtly pushed ahead in social interactions, as her marriage prospects were considered more urgent. Gisela felt the crushing weight of these expectations, a constant, unspoken accusation that she was somehow incomplete, an unfinished project in the eyes of her community. This pervasive social scrutiny and the relentless pressure to conform to the marital ideal were not just inconvenient, they were profoundly isolating and shaming, marking unmarried women as deviant and incomplete in the very fabric of medieval society. Number 1, childlessness and the inability to carry on a lineage. In the world of 1245, a society deeply rooted in lineage, inheritance, and the continuation of family names, perhaps the most profound and emotionally devastating stigma faced by unmarried women was their inability to bear legitimate children, and by extension, to carry on a family lineage. This was not merely a personal sorrow, it was a fundamental failure in the eyes of God, community, and family, cutting to the very core of a woman's perceived purpose and leaving an indelible mark on her social standing and her sense of self-worth. The primary function of marriage, in medieval thought, was procreation. The Bible commanded, "Be fruitful and multiply," and the Church preached that marriage was the legitimate channel for conceiving and raising children in a Christian household. Children were seen as a blessing from God, a workforce for the family, and crucially, the perpetuators of the family name, lands, and traditions. For men, children, especially sons, ensured their legacy and provided care in old age. For women, bearing children was the ultimate act of fulfillment, solidifying their place within their husband's family and ensuring their own immortality through their descendants. An unmarried woman, by definition, could not legitimately have children. If she did conceive out of wedlock, the child would be considered illegitimate, carrying a heavy stigma and often facing legal and social disadvantages throughout its life. The mother, too, would be severely condemned, facing public shaming, ostracization, and ruin. Therefore, for most unmarried women, childlessness was an inevitable consequence of their status, and with it came a profound sense of loss and failure. This inability to produce heirs had significant societal repercussions. For noble and wealthy families, the continuation of the lineage was paramount, intricately tied to land ownership, political power, and the family's very survival. An unmarried daughter was a barren branch on the family tree, contributing nothing to its future growth. Even for peasant families, children were vital for labor and for caring for elderly parents. An unmarried woman meant one less pair of hands for the future, one less person to inherit the modest family plot. Chronicles and legal texts from the time constantly refer to the importance of heirs of the body for maintaining social order and property lines, implicitly sidelining those who could not contribute to this crucial societal function. Consider the anguish of Elara, a woman in her late 40s, living in a small Saxon village. She had never married, having spent her youth tending to a sickly mother who passed away when Elara was already beyond the usual age for marriage. She lived with her married sister and her husband, helping with their children and household chores. Elara adored her nieces and nephews, lavishing them with affection and teaching them songs and stories. But as she watched them grow, her heart often ached with a quiet sorrow. She saw her sister, surrounded by her bustling brood, embodying the very essence of female purpose. Elara, though contributing greatly to her sister's household, felt a profound emptiness within herself. She had no children of her own, no little ones to call her by mother, no direct legacy to pass on. The village implicitly understood this. When discussions turned to children and grandchildren, Elara would politely excuse herself, feeling the weight of her childlessness, a void that no amount of helpfulness or kindness could fill. She was a valuable member of her sister's household, but in the grander tapestry of medieval society, where women's lives were measured by the legitimate children they produced, Elara was perceived as an unfinished story, a branch that bore no fruit. This deep personal sorrow, amplified by societal judgment, was arguably the heaviest burden an unmarried woman carried, a constant reminder of a fundamental purpose left unfulfilled in a world that valued legacy above all else.